Your proposal is interesting, Marcus, but we need someone with more field experience, the hospital board chairman said, looking past me toward my supervisor. My supervisor, Dr. Marcus Thornton, nodded thoughtfully as if considering the feedback, even though the proposal they were discussing was entirely my work. I sat in the conference room at Chicago Memorial Hospital, watching Marcus present my research on reducing surgical complications through improved preoperative screening protocols. Every data point came from my analysis. Every recommendation came from my clinical observations. Every innovation in the proposal came from 18 months of my work. But Marcus's name was on the presentation, and the board was crediting him with insights I'd developed. This was the 9th time in 2 years that Marcus had stolen my research and presented it as his own work to hospital administration, medical conferences, or journal editors. I'd documented every instance meticulously, gathered irrefutable evidence, and planned my response with the precision I brought to surgical procedures. Because what neither Marcus nor this hospital board knew was that I'd already accepted a position as chief of surgery at Boston General, one of the country's most prestigious hospitals. In 3 weeks, I would resign from Chicago Memorial and take my research, my innovations, and my reputation to Boston. And I would expose Marcus's systematic fraud to every medical board, journal, and professional organization that mattered in our field. His career was about to be destroyed so completely that he'd never practice medicine again. Mine was about to flourish in ways he'd tried to prevent by stealing credit for my work. Before we witness how a brilliant surgeon whose research was stolen for years used professional connections and comprehensive documentation to destroy her supervisor while launching her own prestigious career, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes professional theft deserves the same consequences as any other fraud, and that stolen medical research should be exposed publicly. If you've had your professional work stolen, if you've watched supervisors take credit for your innovations, if you've been the invisible talent behind someone else's advancement, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and strategic planning overcome workplace exploitation. Now let's step into the world of academic medicine, where a talented surgeon's research was systematically stolen by her charismatic supervisor, where hospital politics enabled exploitation, and where 2 years of careful preparation created the foundation for complete professional destruction and career triumph. My name is Dr. Maya Rodriguez, and I'm a 36-year-old cardiothoracic surgeon originally from San Antonio, Texas. I grew up in a large Mexican-American family where my father was a construction foreman and my mother worked as a school secretary. I was the first person in my extended family to attend college, let alone medical school. I was always good at math and science, the kid who won science fairs and got straight A's while helping my younger siblings with their homework. I was the oldest of 4 children in my family, responsible for helping care for my younger brothers and sister while my parents worked long hours to support us. The responsibility was heavy but taught me discipline and organization that would later serve me well in medicine. My high school biology teacher, Mrs. Chen, recognized my academic potential during sophomore year. She pulled me aside after class and asked if I'd ever considered becoming a doctor. I told her honestly that medical school seemed impossible for someone from my background, that doctors came from wealthy families with connections and resources we didn't have. Mrs. Chen firmly disagreed. She spent hours after school helping me understand the path to medical school, explaining about pre-med programs, standardized tests, scholarships, and application strategies. She wrote recommendation letters, helped me prepare for the SAT, and encouraged me to apply to top universities despite my doubts about whether I belonged at elite institutions. I earned a full scholarship to Stanford University, covering tuition, room, and board. My parents were proud but anxious about me moving so far from home to attend a school where we knew no one. The scholarship made it financially possible for me to attend an elite university, opening doors I'd never imagined. Stanford was both exciting and culturally challenging. I was surrounded by brilliant students, many from privileged backgrounds very different from mine. My classmates talked casually about family vacations in Europe, second homes, and parents who were doctors, lawyers, or executives. I was often the only person in classes from a working-class background, certainly one of very few Latinas in competitive pre-med courses. Despite the culture shock, I thrived academically. I majored in biology with a focus on human physiology, maintaining excellent grades while working part-time to cover personal expenses. During junior and senior years, I worked in a cardiovascular research lab under Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a prominent cardiac surgeon who became an important mentor. Dr. Warren recognized my potential and pushed me toward cardiothoracic surgery despite it being one of the most competitive and traditionally male-dominated surgical specialties. She told me directly that I'd face extra challenges as a Latina woman, but that the field desperately needed people like me who brought different perspectives to patient care. Medical school at Johns Hopkins was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The academic workload was crushing, the competition was intense, and I was constantly aware of being one of very few Latina women in my class. Financial pressure added another layer of stress since my scholarship covered tuition but not living expenses in expensive Baltimore. I worked as a medical scribe in emergency departments at night and weekends, transcribing physician notes while earning money for rent and food. The work was exhausting on top of medical school demands but gave me valuable clinical exposure. Despite these challenges, I graduated in the top 10% of my class and matched to a prestigious surgical residency. I chose cardiothoracic surgery residency at Northwestern Memorial in Chicago, one of the country's premier training programs. The residency was 7 years of intense work, often 90 or more hours weekly. I assisted on hundreds of procedures, gradually taking on more responsibility until I was performing complex surgeries independently under attending supervision. During residency, I began noticing patterns in surgical complications that seemed preventable. I started tracking data systematically, analyzing which patient factors predicted postoperative problems. The research was time-consuming alongside brutal residency hours, but I was passionate about improving patient outcomes through better risk assessment. My research led to my first major publication in the Journal of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery, analyzing risk factors for complications in valve replacement procedures. The paper was methodologically rigorous and clinically relevant, establishing my reputation as someone who combined strong surgical skills with research capabilities. After completing residency at 33, I was offered a position as an attending surgeon at Chicago Memorial Hospital. The position combined clinical responsibilities performing surgeries with academic responsibilities conducting research and teaching residents. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to build an academic medicine career. My direct supervisor was Dr. Marcus Thornton, Vice Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. Marcus was 48, charming and politically connected, with an impressive publication record and strong relationships with hospital administration. He recruited me personally, saying he was impressed with my research productivity and clinical skills. During my first year at Chicago Memorial, Marcus seemed supportive and encouraging. He included me in interesting cases, gave me opportunities to develop my surgical technique, and seemed genuinely interested in my professional development. When I mentioned continuing my research on surgical complications, he enthusiastically offered to help. The theft started subtly during my second year. I'd share preliminary research findings with Marcus during our weekly meetings, and later I'd hear him discussing similar ideas in department meetings without mentioning they came from me. When I'd point out the similarity, he'd say great minds think alike or that our conversations had inspired him to explore related questions. The first clear instance involved my research on preoperative cardiac imaging protocols. I'd developed a screening approach using advanced imaging to identify high-risk patients, allowing surgeons to modify procedures or optimize patients before surgery. The protocol was innovative with potential to significantly reduce complications. I shared my findings with Marcus in detail, walking him through my methodology and results. 3 months later, Marcus presented at a regional conference on a remarkably similar screening protocol. He described my imaging approach, my risk stratification system, my implementation strategy, all without mentioning I'd created it. He presented it as his own innovation. I felt physically sick watching Marcus receive praise for my work. Colleagues congratulated him afterward. Journal editors approached him about publishing. He was getting recognition and opportunities that should have been mine, all based on research he'd stolen. When I confronted Marcus privately, he seemed surprised and hurt by my accusation. He said he'd been inspired by our conversations to develop his own protocol, that similarities reflected both of us addressing the same clinical problems logically. He suggested I was being territorial about fairly obvious ideas. The gaslighting was effective. Marcus made it seem like I was claiming ownership of common-sense approaches rather than specific innovations I'd developed through careful research. He implied my concern about credit reflected insecurity rather than legitimate complaint about theft. But the pattern continued and intensified. Marcus asked increasingly detailed questions about all my research, my methodologies, my preliminary findings. I'd share information thinking we were having collegial discussions, then I'd see those exact ideas appearing in his presentations, publications, and proposals to administration. During my third year, I developed a quality improvement initiative on reducing postoperative infections through enhanced protocols. After months of analysis and development, it showed promising results. I planned to present findings to administration for broader implementation. Marcus asked to review my data and proposals before I presented, saying he wanted to help me refine my arguments. I shared everything, including detailed protocols, outcome data, and implementation plans. Then Marcus scheduled his own meeting with administration without telling me, presenting my initiative as his own work. I learned about this from a colleague who casually mentioned how impressive Marcus's infection reduction initiative was. When I realized what happened, I felt simultaneously furious and helpless. Marcus had stolen not just credit but the opportunity to present my own work, erasing my contribution so completely that no one knew I'd done it. This time when I confronted Marcus, I was more direct about calling his behavior theft. I said explicitly that he'd presented my research as his own work without acknowledgement. Marcus responded defensively, saying that as vice chief, all quality improvement work happened under his leadership. He said my role was to contribute to departmental initiatives, not expect individual credit. The message was clear. Marcus saw my research as his property to claim. As my supervisor, he felt entitled to take credit for my innovations while keeping me invisible. The power dynamic made fighting back difficult without risking my position. I realized I needed a strategy beyond direct confrontation. Marcus was too politically connected, too established, too skilled at manipulation. I needed comprehensive documentation and a plan that would expose his theft while protecting my career. I began systematically documenting everything. I kept detailed dated notes of every research project I shared with Marcus. I saved all emails describing findings or sharing data. I tracked timelines of when I'd shared information versus when he'd presented similar work publicly. I gathered evidence proving systematic theft beyond any doubt. I also built professional relationships outside Chicago Memorial, networking with surgeons at other hospitals and establishing my reputation independent of Marcus's influence. I published papers as sole author when possible, establishing a clear publication record. I attended conferences and made sure people in the field knew about my research directly from me. Most importantly, I quietly explored positions at other hospitals, looking for opportunities where I could practice and research without an exploitative supervisor. I needed to escape Marcus's theft, but strategically in a way that would expose his fraud while advancing my career. The breakthrough came when a recruiter contacted me about a chief of surgery position at Boston General Hospital, one of the country's most prestigious medical centers. The position was extraordinary, overseeing their entire cardiothoracic surgery program with significant resources for research and teaching. I interviewed over several months, meeting with leadership and faculty. They were impressed with my clinical skills, research productivity, and vision for the program. When they offered the position, I accepted immediately. This was my path out of exploitation and into the leadership role I deserved. I negotiated a start date 3 months out, giving me time to transition cases. But I didn't tell Marcus or anyone at Chicago Memorial until I was ready to execute my resignation strategically. I wanted to control the timing and narrative rather than letting Marcus interfere or claim credit for my success. During those final months, I continued documenting Marcus's theft while preparing my departure. I gathered comprehensive evidence of 9 instances where he'd stolen my research, including emails, presentations, publications, and testimony from colleagues who'd witnessed me developing ideas Marcus later claimed. I drafted detailed letters to be sent after my departure to hospital administration, medical licensing boards, journal editors who'd published Marcus's plagiarized work, and professional organizations where he held leadership positions. The letters would expose 2 years of systematic theft with documentation so thorough that denial would be impossible. The resignation meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning in late August. I arrived at Marcus's office at 8 a.m. with my resignation letter. Marcus was reviewing surgical schedules, completely unaware his career was about to be destroyed. Morning, Maya. I wanted to discuss the new quality metrics administration wants, he began, still looking at his computer. I interrupted by placing my resignation letter on his desk. Actually, Marcus, I'm resigning from Chicago Memorial effective in 2 weeks. This is my formal notice. Marcus's head snapped up, shock replacing casual confidence. He stared at the letter without picking it up. What? You can't just resign. We have active projects. This is unprofessional. I can and am resigning. I've accepted Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at Boston General. I'll transition my cases over 2 weeks, then I'm leaving permanently. Marcus's face flushed red. Chief of Surgery? You're nowhere near ready for that responsibility. You've only been an attending 3 years. This is a mistake. The condescension was predictable. Marcus couldn't accept that I was more talented than him, that I'd been offered a position he probably wanted. His ego required believing I was less capable rather than acknowledging my superiority. It's not a mistake. Boston General recruited me based on my research and clinical outcomes. They believe I'm ready, and I've accepted. They don't know what I know about your work. They don't know how much help you've needed. I should contact them about your limitations. The threat was clear. Marcus was suggesting he'd sabotage my new position with lies about my capabilities. But I'd anticipated this. If you contact Boston General with false information, I'll file formal complaints about your systematic theft of my research over 2 years. I have comprehensive documentation of 9 instances where you presented my work as yours, including emails, presentations, and testimony from colleagues. The evidence is prepared and ready to submit to administration, medical licensing boards, and journal ethics committees. Marcus's face went pale, anger draining as he realized I'd been documenting his theft. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. You're misunderstanding our collaborative relationship. Our research interests naturally overlap. You're being paranoid about normal collegial exchange. It's not collaboration when you present my research without acknowledgement. It's fraud, Marcus. And I have 2 years of evidence proving it systematically. I stood to leave. Marcus stood too, hands shaking slightly as he tried to figure out how to respond. You'll never succeed as chief. You don't have the experience or political skills. You'll fail, and Boston General will regret hiring you. We'll see. Good luck explaining why your recent research looks suspiciously similar to work your former colleague developed. Those will be interesting conversations. I walked out for the last time, leaving Marcus in shock. The relief was immediate and profound. After 2 years of having my work stolen, I was finally free to build a career where my accomplishments would be properly recognized. The next 2 weeks were busy transitioning cases and preparing for departure. Marcus tried several times to approach me for private conversations, probably hoping to negotiate. I refused every attempt, communicating only through email about case transitions. My resignation caused significant surprise in the department. Several colleagues expressed shock that I was leaving for such a prestigious position, not having realized my research and clinical reputation warranted chief opportunities. The surprise made clear how successfully Marcus had kept me invisible. Some colleagues started asking questions about dynamics between Marcus and me, picking up on tension they'd dismissed. A few residents mentioned they'd wondered who actually did the research Marcus presented, since his understanding seemed weaker than his presentations suggested. On my last day, I submitted formal complaints about Marcus's research theft to hospital administration, the Illinois Medical Licensing Board, and editors of 3 journals that had published his plagiarized work. Each complaint was accompanied by comprehensive documentation including emails, presentations, and timeline analysis proving the pattern. The complaints were detailed, specific, and devastating. I didn't make broad accusations. I presented 9 discrete instances of theft, each documented with evidence impossible to explain as coincidence. The pattern was undeniable once someone looked at all instances together. I also sent a letter to the American College of Cardiothoracic Surgeons, where Marcus held a leadership position, outlining his systematic plagiarism. The letter requested investigation of whether someone who'd committed research fraud should hold leadership in a professional organization. The timing was strategic. I submitted everything on my last day, after completing transitions and no longer being dependent on the hospital or Marcus. By the time investigations began, I'd be established at Boston General, protected by distance and prestige. Boston General's response to my arrival was everything I'd hoped for. The hospital held a welcome reception, introduced me to faculty and staff, and gave me resources to build the program into a national leader. My appointment was announced in medical publications and covered in news articles about advancing surgical care. The contrast with Chicago Memorial was stark. At Boston General, my accomplishments were publicly recognized. My research was clearly attributed to me. Leadership promoted my work rather than allowing someone else to claim it. The visibility felt vindicating after years of invisibility. Meanwhile, investigations into Marcus's theft were moving forward. Hospital administration formed a committee to review his publications and presentations, comparing them to my documented research. The Medical Licensing Board opened an investigation. Journal editors reviewed published papers for potential retraction. The story spread rapidly through academic medicine, carried by colleagues who'd witnessed both my research and Marcus's similar later presentations. People who'd wondered about coincidental similarities now understood they'd witnessed systematic theft. Marcus's reputation shifted from respected surgeon to suspected fraud. Within 6 months, Marcus faced devastating consequences. Chicago Memorial suspended him as vice chief pending investigation results. The committee concluded substantial portions of his research had been plagiarized from my work, recommending formal discipline. 3 journals issued expressions of concern, with retraction processes underway. Most damagingly, the Medical Licensing Board found evidence of professional misconduct including plagiarism and fraudulent research authorship. They suspended Marcus's license pending a hearing, effectively preventing him from practicing surgery. The suspension was publicly reported in medical news, ensuring everyone in the field knew about the allegations. The American College of Cardiothoracic Surgeons removed Marcus from leadership and revoked his fellowship status pending investigation. Professional organizations reconsidered awards and recognition. His reputation was destroyed, his career essentially over. Chicago Memorial eventually terminated Marcus for cause after the investigation documented systematic plagiarism. The termination was covered in local news as research fraud at a major hospital, further damaging both his reputation and the institution's credibility. Marcus tried to salvage his career by claiming plagiarism was unintentional, that he'd mistakenly presented collaborative work as sole-authored. But the evidence was too comprehensive and the pattern too systematic for those explanations to be credible. While Marcus's career collapsed, mine flourished at Boston General. My first year as chief was highly successful. I recruited excellent faculty, implemented quality improvements reducing complications by 15%, and grew the program's reputation nationally. I published extensively, finally receiving proper credit for research developed over years. My papers on surgical risk stratification and complication prevention were widely cited, establishing me as a field leader. I was invited to present at national conferences and serve on journal editorial boards. Most satisfyingly, I won the American College of Cardiothoracic Surgeons Award for Innovation in Surgical Safety, recognizing my research on screening protocols and prevention. The ceremony included presenting my work to the field's most prominent surgeons. Several mentioned this recognition was long overdue, that my research had been underappreciated at Chicago Memorial. The validation felt profound after years of stolen work. Finally, my accomplishments were recognized with my name properly attached. Finally, I received opportunities based on my actual contributions rather than being kept invisible while someone else took credit. 2 years after leaving Chicago Memorial, I'm 38 and a successful chief at one of the country's most prestigious hospitals. I've built a strong program, published important research, and established myself as a cardiothoracic surgery leader. I mentor residents and junior faculty, emphasizing protecting intellectual contributions and ensuring proper credit. The experience taught me crucial lessons about workplace exploitation and the importance of documentation, legal protection, and strategic career planning. I learned that confronting theft directly is often ineffective when power dynamics favor the exploiter, and that sometimes the best response is building undeniable success elsewhere while exposing fraud through official channels. I've become an advocate for addressing research misconduct in academic medicine, speaking at conferences about recognizing and preventing plagiarism. I discuss my experience openly, explaining how supervisors sometimes exploit junior colleagues' work and what institutions can do to prevent such exploitation. I occasionally see Marcus's name mentioned in medical discussions, always connected with the plagiarism scandal that destroyed his career. He never recovered professionally. The license suspension became permanent after the board hearing. He lost his position, reputation, and career through his own systematic theft. Meanwhile, I'm thriving with proper recognition, leading a prestigious program, and making meaningful contributions to improving patient outcomes. The trajectory I should have had is finally mine, delayed by Marcus's exploitation but ultimately achieved through my own talent and strategic planning. If this story resonates with you, if you've had your professional work stolen by supervisors, remember that documentation is essential and strategic planning beats impulsive confrontation. Protect your intellectual property through careful records. Build your reputation independent of exploitative relationships. Plan your exit carefully, and expose theft through official channels when protected by new positions. Hit subscribe to join our community that believes professional theft deserves exposure and serious consequences. Share this with someone whose work is being exploited by supervisors who won't give proper credit. Remember that the best response to workplace exploitation often combines personal success with systematic exposure of fraud. The surgeon whose research was stolen for 2 years became chief at a prestigious hospital while her supervisor lost his medical license. The supervisor who claimed credit for innovations he didn't create was permanently barred from practicing medicine. The work that was stolen finally carried the right name, establishing a reputation built on actual accomplishment. Sometimes justice requires patience and strategic planning rather than immediate confrontation. Sometimes protecting your career means leaving exploitative environments rather than trying to fix them. Sometimes the best revenge is succeeding brilliantly while the exploiter faces professional destruction. Marcus thought he could build reputation on my stolen research because academic medicine often enables such exploitation through power dynamics and inadequate oversight. He was half right. The system did enable his theft for 2 years. What he didn't anticipate was that his victim would document everything meticulously, build an independent reputation strong enough to secure a prestigious position elsewhere, and then expose his fraud to every organization that mattered in the field. The invisible surgeon became a celebrated chief of surgery. The credit thief lost his medical license and career. The research that had been stolen was finally properly attributed, advancing the field while establishing the right person's reputation. That's what happens when you steal from someone smart enough to document systematically and strategic enough to wait for the perfect moment to expose fraud. You think you're building a career on borrowed brilliance. Actually, you're building evidence that will destroy you once your victim is safely established elsewhere and ready to act. Marcus learned this watching his career collapse from permanent license suspension while I thrived at Boston General. And academic medicine learned that research theft, even theft disguised as mentorship and collaboration, would eventually be exposed by victims who refused to stay invisible. The experience with Marcus fundamentally changed how I approach professional relationships and mentorship in my current role as chief of surgery. I'm hypervigilant about ensuring proper credit for junior colleagues' work, perhaps overcompensating because I remember how painful it was to have my contributions erased. When residents or fellows develop innovations or conduct research, I make absolutely certain their names are prominently featured on presentations, publications, and proposals. I've implemented policies in my department requiring clear authorship guidelines for all collaborative work. We discuss at the beginning of every project who will be responsible for which components and how credit will be assigned. These conversations sometimes feel awkward or overly formal, but they prevent the kind of ambiguity that Marcus exploited to steal my work. Several junior surgeons have told me they appreciate the explicit discussions about credit and authorship. One fellow mentioned that her previous attending had similar patterns to what I described about Marcus, claiming credit for her research ideas and keeping her invisible. She said knowing that I took authorship and credit seriously was one reason she chose to work with me. I also mentor junior women and minority surgeons explicitly about protecting their intellectual property and ensuring they receive proper recognition for their work. I share my experience with Marcus openly, explaining how exploitation often follows predictable patterns in academic medicine. I teach them about documentation strategies, about building independent reputations, about recognizing gaslighting and manipulation. One conversation that stays with me involved a young Latina resident who came to my office in tears after her attending had presented her research at a conference without crediting her contribution. She felt simultaneously angry and helpless, worried that complaining would damage her relationship with a powerful attending and harm her career prospects. I shared my entire experience with Marcus, showing her the documentation I'd kept and explaining my strategy for exposing his theft once I was protected by my position at Boston General. I explained that she didn't need to accept exploitation, but that responding effectively required careful planning rather than impulsive confrontation. We developed a strategy together for her to document the attending's behavior while building her own reputation independent of him. She started publishing as sole author on projects he wasn't involved with, presenting at conferences, and networking with faculty at other institutions. When she eventually applied for fellowships, she had strong letters from multiple mentors rather than depending solely on the attending who'd exploited her work. She recently sent me a message saying she'd matched to her top choice fellowship program and thanking me for showing her that exploitation didn't have to define her career. She said knowing that I'd faced similar challenges and ultimately succeeded despite them had given her hope and strategy for her own situation. These mentorship conversations feel like the most meaningful part of my current role. I can operate on hearts and save lives, which is deeply gratifying. I can advance surgical techniques through research, contributing knowledge that improves patient care globally. But helping young surgeons avoid or overcome the kind of exploitation I experienced feels like equally important work. Academic medicine has structural problems that enable people like Marcus to exploit junior colleagues systematically. The hierarchical nature of medical training creates enormous power imbalances between attendings and residents or fellows. The credit for collaborative work is often ambiguous, allowing senior people to claim disproportionate recognition. The culture discourages complaints about mistreatment, framing them as weakness or inability to handle rigorous training environments. These structural issues persist despite individual bad actors being removed. Marcus is gone from Chicago Memorial, but the systems that enabled his exploitation for 2 years remain largely unchanged. Other supervisors with similar predatory patterns probably continue exploiting junior colleagues because the incentives and protections favor them. I've become involved in efforts to reform these structural problems through professional organizations and institutional policy. I serve on a task force for the American College of Cardiothoracic Surgeons focused on research ethics and preventing exploitation in academic medicine. We're developing guidelines for authorship attribution, recommendations for institutional oversight of supervisor-trainee relationships, and whistleblower protections for people who report exploitation. The work is slow and sometimes frustrating because changing entrenched institutional practices requires overcoming significant inertia and resistance. Senior faculty who benefited from current systems often don't see problems that seem obvious to those of us who experienced exploitation. Administrators worry about institutional liability and reputation more than addressing misconduct proactively. But progress is happening gradually. More institutions are implementing formal authorship policies requiring clear documentation of individual contributions to collaborative work. More professional organizations are taking research misconduct seriously, investigating complaints thoroughly rather than protecting powerful members. More junior trainees are aware of exploitation patterns and empowered to document and report mistreatment. My exposure of Marcus contributed to this broader shift in how academic medicine addresses research theft and exploitation. My case became a reference point for discussions about what constitutes plagiarism in collaborative research environments, how power dynamics enable exploitation, and what effective responses look like. Medical education programs use my experience as a case study in research ethics courses. The publicity around Marcus's license suspension and termination sent a clear message that research theft would have serious consequences even for established, well-connected physicians. Several colleagues told me that my case made them more careful about properly crediting collaborators' work, worried that similar documentation of their own casual credit theft might exist. Boston General has also learned from my experience, implementing stronger policies about research integrity and oversight of senior faculty. When they recruited me, hospital leadership was primarily interested in my clinical skills and research productivity. After I explained why I was leaving Chicago Memorial, they became very interested in ensuring their own institution didn't enable similar exploitation. The hospital now requires annual training on research ethics for all faculty, with specific content about appropriate attribution and recognizing exploitation patterns. Department chairs receive training on identifying and addressing credit theft or other forms of professional misconduct. There's a confidential reporting system for trainees to raise concerns about mistreatment without fear of retaliation. These institutional changes feel like meaningful progress beyond my personal vindication. Marcus's exploitation of my work was individual misconduct, but it was enabled by institutional structures and culture that didn't adequately protect junior faculty or trainees. Changing those structures helps prevent future exploitation rather than just punishing past misconduct. I occasionally wonder what Marcus is doing now, 3 years after losing his medical license. I've never searched for him online or asked former colleagues, preferring to leave him in my past. Some part of me hopes he's struggling, facing daily consequences for his theft. But mostly I just don't think about him, focused on my own work and on helping others. The vindictive satisfaction I imagined feeling about his professional destruction was real but brief. Watching his career collapse was gratifying for perhaps a month. Then it just became a fact of the past, less emotionally significant than my own daily successes and my ongoing work training the next generation of surgeons. What does give me sustained satisfaction is the professional recognition I'm finally receiving. When I present research at conferences, my name is on the presentations and people know the work is mine. When surgeons cite my papers, they're citing my actual research with proper attribution. When trainees ask to work with me, it's because of my reputation for excellent surgical training and fair treatment, not because of work I've stolen from others. The contrast with my experience under Marcus is stark enough that I still sometimes feel almost surprised by proper credit and recognition. 3 years into my role as chief, I still have moments of thinking, they're actually crediting me for my own work, with a sense of relief and vindication. The exploitation left psychological scars that are healing slowly but remain visible. My husband, David, who's an engineer at a tech company in Boston, has been incredibly supportive throughout this whole experience. We met during medical school and married during my residency, so he witnessed the entire arc of Marcus's exploitation, my strategic planning, and eventual triumph. He was my sounding board when I was documenting theft and planning my exit from Chicago Memorial. David understood the professional dynamics even though his field is different from medicine. His own work in software engineering involves similar issues around intellectual property, credit for innovations, and powerful colleagues sometimes taking advantage of less senior people's work. He validated my experience when I doubted my own perceptions, confirmed that Marcus's behavior was exploitation rather than normal mentorship. When I was debating whether to accept the Boston General position and expose Marcus's theft, David supported both decisions without hesitation. He was willing to relocate from Chicago to Boston for my career advancement. He encouraged me to file complaints rather than just leaving quietly, saying that Marcus deserved consequences and future potential victims deserved protection from his exploitation. We have 2 young children now, a daughter who's 4 and a son who's 18 months. Balancing being chief of surgery with parenting is challenging in ways residency didn't prepare me for. The hours are demanding, the responsibility is enormous, and coming home to toddlers who need attention after performing high-stakes surgery all day is exhausting. But I'm determined to show my children, especially my daughter, that women can lead in traditionally male fields like cardiac surgery. I want her to grow up seeing her mother as a successful surgeon and leader, knowing that her ethnicity and gender don't limit her professional possibilities. I want her to have the confidence I sometimes lacked, the sense of belonging I had to fight for. My daughter already plays doctor with her stuffed animals, using a toy stethoscope to check their hearts before performing elaborate pretend surgeries. She tells people confidently that she's going to be a heart surgeon like her mommy. Watching her embody that possibility so naturally feels like a kind of intergenerational healing, undoing messages I internalized about who gets to be doctors. My son is still too young to understand what I do professionally, but I look forward to him also growing up with the assumption that Latina women can be cardiac surgeons and department chiefs. I want both my children to understand that their mother succeeded not just despite barriers but through strategic planning, documentation, and refusing to accept exploitation. The story I'll eventually tell them about Marcus and Chicago Memorial will be about standing up for yourself professionally, about the importance of documentation when facing mistreatment, about building success elsewhere rather than accepting exploitation from people who should mentor you properly. It's a story about justice delayed but ultimately achieved through patient strategic planning. Boston General recently promoted me from Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery to Vice President of Surgical Services, giving me oversight of all surgical departments across the hospital system. The promotion reflects both my success leading the cardiothoracic program and the hospital's confidence in my leadership abilities. It's another major advancement in the trajectory Marcus tried to prevent by keeping me invisible while stealing my work. The new role involves less time operating and more time in administration, which I have mixed feelings about. I love surgery, love the immediate impact of repairing hearts and saving lives. But the administrative role allows me to implement changes across departments, improving systems and mentoring many more surgeons than I could reach directly in one department. In my new role, I've prioritized policies addressing research ethics, proper attribution, and preventing exploitation of junior staff across all surgical disciplines. The policies I developed for cardiothoracic surgery are now being implemented hospital-wide, creating protections for residents and fellows in every surgical specialty. I also chair a committee reviewing complaints about mistreatment or misconduct involving surgical faculty. Several cases we've reviewed involved patterns remarkably similar to Marcus's exploitation, senior surgeons systematically taking credit for junior colleagues' work. Having experienced that myself makes me particularly effective at recognizing the patterns and recommending appropriate responses. One case involved a plastic surgery attending who'd been presenting residents' research as his own work at conferences for years. The pattern was nearly identical to Marcus's theft of my research. When residents finally complained, the attending used similar gaslighting tactics, claiming the work was collaborative and that the residents were being territorial about common ideas. We documented the pattern thoroughly, comparing presentations with residents' original research notes and emails. The evidence was overwhelming once assembled systematically. We recommended and the hospital implemented a formal reprimand, mandatory ethics training, and ongoing oversight of his research collaborations. The attending was also required to publicly correct attribution on previously presented research. The case felt personally significant because I could help other victims of exactly the exploitation I'd experienced. The residents thanked me afterward for taking their complaints seriously and believing their accounts of exploitation. They said previous administrators had dismissed their concerns as normal academic medicine hierarchies. These opportunities to prevent or address exploitation of others feel like the most meaningful aspect of my professional success. Marcus tried to keep me invisible and claim my work. Instead, I'm now in a position of significant influence, using my experience and authority to protect other people from similar exploitation. The vindication isn't just personal advancement and proper recognition for my own work, though both of those matter enormously. The vindication is also being able to change systems so that fewer people experience what I experienced, so that the next talented young surgeon doesn't face a supervisor like Marcus without institutional protections. Looking back at my entire career arc, from growing up in working-class San Antonio through Stanford and Hopkins to residency at Northwestern and exploitation at Chicago Memorial to my current leadership role at Boston General, I see a story of talent and determination but also of strategic thinking and patient planning. I could have confronted Marcus impulsively when I first realized he was stealing my research. I could have filed complaints while still working under him at Chicago Memorial. I could have accepted that academic medicine involves some degree of senior people claiming credit for junior people's work. Each of those paths would have led to worse outcomes than the strategy I actually pursued. Instead, I documented systematically for 2 years while building my reputation independent of Marcus. I secured a prestigious position elsewhere before exposing his theft. I filed complaints only after I was protected by my new role and couldn't face retaliation. The patience and strategic planning made all the difference in achieving both personal success and consequences for Marcus's exploitation. That lesson, about the importance of strategic patience and documentation rather than impulsive confrontation, is what I emphasize when mentoring others facing workplace exploitation. Your anger is valid, your sense of injustice is real, but responding effectively requires planning and protection rather than immediate confrontation when you're vulnerable. Marcus probably assumed I would either accept his exploitation indefinitely or complain impulsively in ways he could deflect or use to damage my reputation. What he didn't anticipate was that I'd document everything meticulously, build my career strategically, and then expose him from a position of strength once I was beyond his reach. That miscalculation cost him his medical license, his position, his reputation, and his career. My strategic patience and planning led to his complete professional destruction while I advanced to roles he'd probably coveted himself. The invisible surgeon whose work he stole became far more successful and influential than he ever was, even before his downfall. 3 years after Marcus's license suspension, I'm thriving personally and professionally in ways I couldn't have imagined during the worst periods of exploitation at Chicago Memorial. I'm a successful hospital executive, a respected cardiac surgeon, a researcher whose work is properly attributed and widely cited, a mentor to dozens of young surgeons, and a mother to 2 beautiful children. The career arc Marcus tried to prevent by stealing my work not only happened but exceeded what seemed possible when I was an invisible attending whose contributions were systematically erased. The vindication is complete, the justice is achieved, and the success is undeniable. If this story resonates with your own experience of workplace exploitation, remember these lessons. Document systematically when mistreatment occurs. Build your professional reputation independent of exploitative relationships. Plan your exit strategically before taking action. Expose misconduct from positions of strength rather than vulnerability. Believe in your own talent and worth even when others try to keep you invisible. The supervisor who tried to build his reputation on stolen research is permanently barred from medicine. The surgeon whose work was stolen is now a hospital executive protecting others from similar exploitation. Justice was delayed but ultimately thorough, demonstrating that strategic patience and documentation can overcome even entrenched workplace exploitation. Marcus learned too late that stealing from someone smart, strategic, and patient means building your career on foundations that will crumble once your victim decides the time is right to expose your fraud. He spent 2 years thinking he was successfully exploiting a junior colleague. Actually, he was creating the evidence that would destroy him once she was safe elsewhere and ready to act. The quiet surgeon who sat in meetings watching her supervisor present her stolen research became the hospital executive setting policies to prevent such exploitation. The invisible colleague became a celebrated leader. And the research that was stolen was finally correctly attributed, establishing exactly the reputation its true author deserved. One unexpected aspect of my success at Boston General has been the media attention my story has received. A health journalism reporter at the Boston Globe learned about Marcus's license suspension and Chicago Memorial scandal through medical community sources. She reached out to interview me about my experience, and I decided to participate rather than declining as I might have earlier in my career. The resulting article, titled, "How a Stolen Research Scandal Exposed Exploitation in Academic Medicine," was published on the Globe's front page and went viral within medical communities nationally. The reporter did excellent work presenting my experience as illustrative of broader systemic problems in academic medicine, not just an isolated incident of individual misconduct. The article included my account of Marcus's systematic theft, the 2 years I spent documenting evidence while suffering invisibility for my innovations, my strategic exit to Boston General, and the formal complaints that ultimately resulted in his license suspension. The reporter interviewed colleagues who confirmed the patterns I described and experts who explained how power dynamics in academic medicine enable such exploitation. What made the article particularly impactful was framing my experience within broader discussions about how academic medicine treats women, minorities, and other historically marginalized groups. The reporter connected my specific case to research showing that women physicians publish less and advance more slowly than male colleagues, partly because senior men disproportionately claim credit for women's work and ideas. Several prominent women physicians contacted me after the article published, sharing their own experiences of having supervisors or senior colleagues steal credit for their research, innovations, or clinical insights. The stories were remarkably similar despite coming from different institutions, specialties, and time periods. The patterns of exploitation appeared systemic rather than isolated incidents. One particularly moving message came from Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, a senior Latina surgeon at a California hospital who'd experienced similar exploitation earlier in her career but hadn't had the documentation or strategic positioning to expose her exploiter effectively. She said reading about my experience brought up painful memories but also gave her a sense of vindication knowing that at least one person had successfully held a credit thief accountable. Dr. Gonzalez and I now collaborate on research about credit theft and exploitation in academic medicine, surveying women and minority physicians about their experiences and developing recommendations for institutional protections. The work is personally meaningful because it transforms my individual experience into data and policy changes that could protect many others. Our preliminary survey results are striking. Approximately 40% of women physicians we surveyed reported experiencing at least one instance of a supervisor or senior colleague taking credit for their work without proper acknowledgement. The percentage was even higher among women of color, with over half reporting such experiences. Many described patterns remarkably similar to my experience with Marcus. The survey also revealed that most victims of credit theft never formally reported the exploitation because they feared retaliation, didn't believe institutions would address complaints effectively, or didn't know how to document and report misconduct. Those who did report often experienced dismissal of their concerns or minimal consequences for exploiters. These findings confirm that Marcus wasn't an isolated bad actor but rather an example of exploitation patterns that remain common in academic medicine despite increasing awareness of professional misconduct issues. The research we're conducting aims to give institutions data they can use to recognize problems and implement effective protections. We're preparing publications for major medical journals presenting our survey findings alongside policy recommendations. The recommendations include requiring clear authorship agreements for all collaborative work, implementing confidential reporting systems with anti-retaliation protections, training department chairs to recognize exploitation patterns, and creating transparent processes for investigating credit theft complaints. Several medical schools and hospitals have already expressed interest in implementing our recommended policies. Boston General is serving as a pilot site, allowing us to study which interventions are most effective at preventing exploitation and supporting people who do report mistreatment. The institutional commitment to evidence-based policy development feels like meaningful progress. I've also been invited to present keynote talks at several major medical conferences about my experience and our research on addressing exploitation in academic medicine. These speaking opportunities allow me to reach thousands of physicians, sharing both my personal story and our evidence-based recommendations for systemic change. At one conference, a young male resident approached me after my presentation and said something that stuck with me. He said he'd always assumed credit theft primarily affected women and minorities, but hearing my story made him realize he should be more careful about properly acknowledging collaborators' contributions in his own work. He said he'd probably been casually taking more credit than appropriate in some situations without recognizing it as exploitation. His comment reminded me that changing cultural norms requires engaging not just potential victims but also people who might casually exploit others without seeing their behavior as problematic. Many instances of credit theft probably aren't as systematic and deliberate as Marcus's exploitation of my work, but rather reflect cultural assumptions about who deserves credit and whose contributions matter. Teaching physicians to recognize and prevent even casual credit theft could significantly reduce exploitation across academic medicine. When senior surgeons consistently model proper acknowledgement of collaborators' work, it creates culture where taking undue credit becomes socially unacceptable rather than normalized practice. My children are still too young to fully understand my professional work, but they're growing up knowing their mother is someone other people listen to about important topics. My daughter has attended a few of my presentations at local events, sitting in the audience and beaming with pride even though the content is far over her head. She tells her preschool friends that her mommy is a doctor who teaches other doctors how to be fair. That framing, teaching doctors to be fair, is actually a pretty good summary of significant portions of my current work. I'm teaching through my research, my policy development, my committee work reviewing misconduct complaints, and my mentorship of junior colleagues. The teaching is about fairness, about ensuring people receive credit they deserve, about preventing exploitation of vulnerable people by powerful ones. My father, who's now 70 and retired from construction work, once told me he never imagined when I left for Stanford that I'd become someone who changed how major hospitals operate and how doctors treat each other. He said he's proud I'm successful but even more proud that I'm using my success to help other people avoid what I experienced. That comment captured something important about how I think about my career now. The conventional markers of success matter. Chief of Surgery became Vice President of Surgical Services, publications in major journals, presentations at prestigious conferences, awards from professional organizations. Those achievements provide satisfaction and validation after years of exploitation. But the success that feels most meaningful involves changing systems and helping others. When a resident tells me that our new authorship policies prevented a supervisor from stealing credit for her research, that feels more significant than another publication with my name on it. When a fellow tells me she chose Boston General partly because of our reputation for treating junior staff fairly, that feels more important than another promotion. Marcus tried to keep me invisible while building his reputation on my stolen work. The ultimate revenge isn't just that I became visible and successful while he lost everything. The ultimate revenge is that I'm using my visibility and success to create systems that prevent others from experiencing the exploitation he inflicted on me. Every policy I implement protecting junior faculty, every complaint I take seriously about potential misconduct, every young surgeon I mentor about documentation and professional boundaries, every presentation I give about preventing exploitation, they're all part of ensuring Marcus's legacy isn't just his own destroyed career but also the systemic changes his misconduct helped catalyze. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I'd never documented Marcus's theft, if I'd just accepted that academic medicine involved senior people claiming credit for junior people's work, if I'd stayed at Chicago Memorial letting him continue to erase my contributions. I'd probably still be an attending surgeon doing good work but receiving no recognition. Marcus would still be vice chief, probably still stealing work from whoever replaced me. Nothing would have changed. Instead, Marcus lost his medical license and career. I became a hospital executive in position to implement meaningful policy changes. Chicago Memorial reformed their research integrity policies after the scandal. Multiple institutions adopted stronger protections against credit theft. The American College of Cardiothoracic Surgeons strengthened their ethics guidelines. Academic medicine became more aware of exploitation patterns and more committed to addressing them. All of those changes happened because I documented systematically, planned strategically, and chose the right moment to expose fraud from a position of strength. The impact extends far beyond my personal vindication or Marcus's deserved destruction. The impact includes systemic changes protecting thousands of current and future physicians from similar exploitation. That broader impact transforms my experience from a personal story of injustice and revenge into a professional story about using individual experience to catalyze institutional change. Marcus exploited me for 2 years, causing real harm to my career development and psychological well-being. But my response to that exploitation created positive changes that will prevent similar harm to many others. If I could go back and avoid the exploitation entirely, of course I would. The 2 years of having my work stolen while remaining invisible were painful and damaging. The stress of documenting evidence while pretending everything was fine took a toll. The anger and frustration and self-doubt were real and difficult. But given that the exploitation happened, I'm grateful I responded as effectively as I did. I'm grateful I documented rather than just accepting the injustice. I'm grateful I planned strategically rather than confronting impulsively. I'm grateful I used my experience to help others rather than just moving on quietly once I'd escaped. Marcus probably thought exploiting a young Latina surgeon would be easy and consequence-free, that I'd either accept the exploitation or complain ineffectively in ways he could dismiss. He was catastrophically wrong about both my abilities and my willingness to fight for proper recognition of my work. His miscalculation about who I was and what I was capable of cost him everything while elevating me to positions of influence he never imagined I'd achieve. The surgeon Marcus tried to keep invisible is now one of the most visible and influential young leaders in cardiac surgery. The surgeon whose work he stole is now recognized for creating significant innovations in surgical safety. The surgeon he exploited is now protecting others from similar exploitation through policy development and institutional leadership. And Marcus himself, the charismatic vice chief who seemed so powerful when I was his subordinate, is permanently barred from practicing medicine and known primarily as an example of what happens when research fraud is thoroughly exposed. His legacy is serving as a cautionary tale in medical ethics courses and a catalyst for policy reforms aimed at preventing the exploitation he inflicted. 3 years after exposing his theft, I sometimes go entire weeks without thinking about Marcus or the exploitation I experienced. The experience shaped my career and my approach to leadership, but it no longer dominates my professional identity. I'm too busy with my current responsibilities and future goals to dwell on past injustices that have already been thoroughly addressed. That psychological freedom, the ability to move forward without being defined by having been a victim of exploitation, feels like another form of victory. Marcus tried to make me invisible, to erase my contributions, to define my career by his theft. Instead, my career is defined by my own accomplishments and by the positive changes I'm implementing to help others. When I do think about Marcus, it's usually in context of mentoring someone facing similar exploitation or reviewing a misconduct complaint with familiar patterns. In those moments, my experience with him becomes useful knowledge for addressing current problems rather than painful history that limits my present. The transformation from victim to advocate, from exploited junior faculty to protective senior leader, from invisible surgeon to visible change agent, represents complete triumph over Marcus's attempted exploitation. He tried to steal my success by claiming my work. Instead, his theft became the foundation for success exceeding what either of us imagined possible when I was his subordinate. That irony, that Marcus's exploitation ultimately catalyzed achievements and influence he tried to prevent, feels like the most complete form of vindication. He thought he was building his career on my work. Actually, he was creating conditions that would eventually make me far more successful and influential than him, while destroying himself completely. The quiet surgeon who sat in meetings watching her supervisor present her stolen research grew into a hospital executive setting policies affecting thousands of physicians, a researcher whose work advances both surgical techniques and professional ethics, a mentor protecting vulnerable colleagues from exploitation, and a leader using personal experience to catalyze systemic change. And the supervisor who thought he could exploit that surgeon with impunity learned that underestimating someone's capabilities while exploiting their work is a catastrophic mistake. His career ended in permanent license suspension and professional disgrace. Her career flourished into positions of influence and respect he never achieved even before his downfall. That's what happens when you steal from someone who's smarter, more strategic, more patient, and ultimately more talented than you are. You think you're building on borrowed brilliance. Actually, you're creating the evidence and motivation for your own complete destruction while catalyzing your victim's rise to positions where she can ensure you're the last person to exploit others as you exploited her. Marcus learned that lesson too late to save his career. Academic medicine learned it in time to implement reforms protecting future potential victims. And I learned that surviving exploitation and achieving strategic vindication can transform individual injustice into catalyst for meaningful systemic change. The invisible surgeon became visible. The stolen work was correctly attributed. The exploiter was permanently barred from medicine. And the broader system became slightly more just because one person refused to accept exploitation and responded with documentation, strategic planning, and commitment to preventing others from experiencing similar injustice.